All right, I'm going to gather us together.
She's going to get us started. Here.
So I'm Mira Levinson. I am the co-convener of the Civic and Moral Education Initiative here at the Ed School. Welcome. I'm really excited today in a second to introduce Juan and Tatiana. But before I do that, let me just give you an eye toward the last event, the last CMEI event this semester, which is a 2-day conference extravaganza that actually promises to be really, really, really amazing. That is on May 3rd and 4th. That is the pulls together scholars from the Early Career Scholars Program here at the Ed School, who include some of now the leading scholars in civic education kind of around actually the world. And there's going to be a plenary session the first day, specifically also on issues of migration and immigration and education. Do you remember who? So I know Michelle Bellino and that's Sarah Dryden-Peterson and you,
yes,
right?
And Nikit.
And Nikit, yes. And is that the correct sort of theme? Do you want to? Is that the right description of the?
Sure, I can give a second plug for
yeah.
it. So it's going to focus on youth participatory action research and how that fits or doesn't fit within context of forced migration and displacement and working with refugee youth, or some of the tensions that emerge.
Great, thank you. That's an even more inspiring description. And it's just an amazing lineup that Helen Haste, who's the other co-convener of CMEI, has put together. And so I think the conference program I know is now available on the web, right? And if you Google ECSP conference, I think you'll find it. But if the other thing is that you'll be able to find out about it. We're going to send around the sign-up sheet. As always, please at least write your name so that we're about to go to the dean and ask for some money for next year. But then also, if you are not actually on the Civic and Moral Education Initiative listserv and you would like to be, then write your email and then give us some sense of your affiliation. And then you will end up receiving information about the conference. I can promise you we try not to spam you with the CMEI listserv too much. And it's a good place to learn about not only our colloquia, but also about extant conferences and publication opportunities and things like that. So with that being said, this is our final colloquium of the spring, and I'm super duper excited that we have Juan Espindola here to talk to us about education and the ethics of return migration. Juan is a political theorist who's an assistant professor at CIDE in Mexico City. He was trained, he got his PhD in Michigan, was in Frankfurt, was that right? Yes. And so has an appropriately cosmopolitan view of the world and of political theory as well, which is exciting, and thinking about education. And he does work beyond the work on this on private schools, including low-fee private schools, issues of justice more broadly, issues of school choice, right? And it's just really great. And then we have, and then as a respondent, Tatiana Guerin is a first-year doctoral student here at the Ed School. She is a former teacher. She taught for 5 years in the Boston and the New York public schools. She is also a theorist and ethicist by training, and has worked this year with me on actually a case study about the ethics of thinking about undocumented, keeping undocumented students safe in schools while also dealing with growing concerns around gang violence in schools and communities, and is also working on another case study about race and teaching about race, and does also terrific work. So we're going to hear from Juan for half an hour or so. We'll hear from Tatiana for 5 or 10 minutes. That will definitely be enough to get our thinking going, and at that point it's a free-for-all for all of us, and hopefully we'll have at least a good 30 to 40 minutes to talk together. Great, and so I'm going to send around the sign-up sheet, and it's over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mira. Thank you for the invitation, and thanks to Tatiana for accepting to comment on the presentation and the paper, and thank you all for being here. So I'm gonna present to you something that it's based in part on a paper that I wrote with.
Sorry, can I interrupt? I realized because of the
Oh.
HVAC and the fact
I
that
need
we
to put this on.
please do you mind if I did not need to have to do that, but I think it will help all of us here, especially the videotape. It's okay. Great.
I think that's good.
Yeah.
Excellent. So I was saying that this presentation is based on a paper that I wrote with my colleague Monica Jacobo, in which we sort of our colleague had seated, and we tried to join forces to combine her interest on return migration from a more educational policy perspective, and my interest on educational justice and the ethics of immigration. And the paper is available if any of you is interested on it. And in this presentation, I'm going to say, for the most part, stick to that paper, but I'm also going to add a few ideas that are not there. And so we decided in writing this paper and also in this presentation that it would be interesting to so literature on the ethics of immigration usually does not discuss the problem of return migration at all, or very superficial. And so we set out to investigate whether that was a significant omission or if that was something that was worth pursuing. Well, it turns out it is. We think that it is, otherwise it wouldn't be here. And that's more or less what I'm going to try to show you in the presentation, that it is something important. And to start to get the discussion going, or before even I get to that, I wanted to ask, like, is anyone here interested in ethics, philosophers, just to get a sense of. Okay. So to get the discussion going, I'd like to zoom in on in the case of a returned student whose name is Jorge. So this case is drawn from an interview by my colleague Monica Jacobo, but you can find many similar cases in the work of Victor Zúñiga and Edmond Hamann, who are the pioneers on the study of return migration in Mexico, and some other authors like Sarah Gallo from Ohio State. A number of people are now working on this issue. But this case is based on that interview, and it's about Jorge. And Jorge's mother returned to Mexico City after 4 years as an undocumented farm worker in the U.S. And Jorge and his brother were 7 and 10, and they came along with her. They were born in California, and they had never previously visited their new town in San Martin Peral, Oaxaca. That's a southern state in Mexico. And they did not speak any Spanish. They only spoke, or barely any Spanish. They only spoke English and the region's indigenous Mixteco language. So when they got into school, the struggle was very harsh, for them. They did not participate a lot in class because they did not feel confident about their skills, especially Jorge. Peers called them names, they laughed at their Spanish, they bullied him. His teacher didn't do much about it because he couldn't or because he didn't want to. And as a result, Jorge sat in class unable to understand anything, to participate. And her mother remembers that he cried every day, and he begged her to take him back to the US. So this is a case, maybe not prototypical, but it's a very common case. And the question is, what is the takeaway point from the case? One is that school in Mexico was not prepared to accommodate Jorge, his returned student, and that's perhaps no surprise given the level of dysfunctionality of the Mexican educational system, which I won't get into because I'll be here all day. But it also shows, and this is I think the part that I want to underscore in this presentation, that the education he received in the US did not prepare him to transition to the Mexican educational system. Maybe, and this is a big maybe, it prepared him to be integrated into the American society, but it did not prepare him to make an educational trajectory that was not far-fetched to expect, given the migratory status of the model. So this begs the question, did Jorge receive the kind of education in the American educational system that he deserved as a matter of justice? And I think it's critical that we bear in mind cases like this one when we think about immigrant education, because cases like this one defy commonly held ideas about the kind of education that immigrants deserve. So, need and deserve. So this is, again, this is more or less the outline of the presentation. I might skip a few things given that. So I originally prepared 40 minutes to talk, but I myself want to like keep it shorter than that. I might skip some slides, apologies for that. But this is more or less the outline of the presentation. I'm first going to discuss somewhat some of the main concerns of ethical debates of immigration. What I think that are the main concerns of ethical debates, and why I think they neglect an important dimension of educational justice. Then I'm going to describe in a bit more detail what return migration is, and I'm going to focus on the case of Mexico and the US, although I think there's things to say about other cases of return migration in the world. Then I'm going to try to argue that the acknowledgement of return migration must shape our understanding of the kind of education that immigrant children should receive or to receive, and then I'll make a few remarks about the methodological commitments of these ethical theories. That's a pretty good candidate for not being addressed in the presentation, but we'll see how it goes. Okay, so the main concerns in current debates about the ethics of immigration, I think, are two. One is the morality of immigration restrictions, and the question here that the theories pose is whether the state has a moral right to control borders, right, to exclude immigrants or to impose admission criteria. And there are very interesting debates going on in the scholarly literature on this subject. For instance, can states select immigrants on the basis of ethnic or socioeconomic criteria? That's a very hotly debated topic. But for the purposes of this presentation and this subject, that's not really the relevant debate. The relevant debate is the second debate, which is about the morality of inclusion. And the question here is, on what terms should immigrants be integrated into society? And since the concern is about immigrants and the terms of their inclusion, then education becomes very relevant. So a more specific question would be here, what kind of instruction should children of immigrants receive? To name a couple of big names in the debate, Joseph Carens is one of the most influential theorists of immigration, and he develops what he calls the membership theory of immigration. And I'm not going to go into any detail about the theory, but basically the idea is that once immigrants have built ties to the community, they have a right to stay. So belonging to a community matters morally, and so they've been around, and they've worked in the society, they've been good denizens, they have a right to stay, and eventually to become citizens. Carens thinks that the educational rights of immigrant children should be, in a way, consonant to that right to stay. And so he writes a passage from his work that's in educating the child in its own school system, a state is preparing the child to live in the society that it governs, not in the society that the child's parents came from. Indeed, that is one reason why children should have a right to live in the society in which they are raised, regardless of the legal status of their parents. Then, to mention another theorist, David Miller, who has, in many ways, very contrasting views to Carens. He also sort of argues, when he thinks about education, he thinks about education more or less in the same terms. So when he invokes education, he thinks that It's very relevant insofar as it helps immigrants understand their norms and responsibilities of citizenship in the whole society. Or he thinks occasional schooling is important because it promotes interactions between immigrants and citizens, and in that way it reduces prejudices against immigrants. And he superficially mentions education and how it can help immigrants, or whether it should help immigrants maintain their heritage culture, but this is a concern that he doesn't really get into in a lot of detail. But okay, so I think that this, both Carens and Miller defend what we may call educational for cultural and civic integration in the context of immigration. And I think this conception of education has many strengths, but we also think that it has some limitations. Right? And I think the problem with this, or the weaknesses of these theories, come from two assumptions that it makes. Right? So the first assumption, which we can call a factual or empirical assumption, is that immigrant and immigrant children will settle in the whole society. And then there's a normative assumption in that because they ought to be allowed to stay there, then whatever we have to say about, whatever moral judgment we have about them or the prescriptions we have to be understood within the parameters of that right to stay. So I think those are two assumptions that they make, and we think that those, like I said, that in many cases, or at least in important cases, those assumptions do not fall. So we have to rethink immigrant education in light of that fact. And so I'm going to bracket the normative assumption for now, but I am going to put emphasis on, I'm going to try to show you how this factual assumption does not hold. And to do that, I'm going to just talk to you very briefly about the stages I'm going to make a periodization of immigration patterns between Mexico and the US. Very, very briefly. Broadly speaking, there have been three major eras in immigration from Mexico to the US, and since the 20th century. And so the first stage, which is, it goes from the 1900s to the 1980s, immigration from Mexico to the US was a circulatory and seasonal phenomenon mostly. It involved post-schooling male adults who were married, who did not have a family, and who did not want to settle in the US. And in this immigration flow, children were absent, essentially, or they were not main actors. But that changed in the mid-80s when there was an anti-immigration environment that began to grow pretty much like the one that exists today. And as a consequence of that and other things, the border was militarized. And obviously the goal was to keep Mexicans out of the US, but actually that action had the opposite effect, which was to keep them in, right? Because once they made it here, it just didn't make any sense for them to risk their lives in a very inhumane border crossing. And so they in fact, what they did was they settled, they formed families there, or in many cases they tried to bring relatives with them. And here children were very much present, of course. And then the present stage where there's been actually this process of return migration, where actually not a lot of people know this, but there are more Mexicans going back to Mexico, or Mexican and Mexican Americans going to Mexico than there are Mexicans coming to the US. And here again, children are very much present. And so this is a graph that sort of like shows that. This might be a very confusing chart, but I just want you to see the blue bar, which are shows the amount of removals, which basically events associated with deportation. So you see how that's been growing in years. So there's three bars because some come from data from the US and other data from Mexico. And so they should match, but they don't. But the important part is the blue bar, right? You see that there's ramped up deportations are very much in the horizon. Okay, so to give you some figures, return migration of minors, which peaked in 2010, there were about 600,000 children in Mexico who had previously lived in the US. And if you extend that to 24 years, then it's about 700,000 children. And in 2015, there were about 480,000 children in Mexico. And here the data are very unreliable, because I was at the ARA conference in New York last week, and there, Hammond, I mentioned him in the beginning, who's one of the pioneers. He mentioned the figure that in K-9 there were about 700,000 children in the Mexican educational system. So that's a figure, more or less. They're like more than 500,000. It's important to mention that the majority of minors have been mostly or entirely raised in the US. I was saying that some of them are American citizens, but not all of them are. But I refer to all of them as immigrant children, even if they are US citizens, because in many ways they form a family here. Right? In many cases, even though they're American citizens, they have to go back to, for instance, if a parent is reported, then they usually have to join them, right? So, to sum up, immigrant families do not have a guarantee of permanent residence in the U.S., and they may be forced to return as a result of political coercion in the case of deportation, as a result of economic forces when they lose a job, or contingencies like when a relative is ill and they have to return to Mexico, or they are ill here and they don't have a safety net, so they have to return. Sometimes when I say return, I have to put it in scare quotes, because like I said, some of these children have never been to Mexico City, so they're not really returning, but the families usually are. Or they may return because of a voluntary decision. Okay, so when these children return to when they enroll into the Mexican educational system, they experience cultural, linguistic, and identity shock. And this might not be surprising, and maybe not even be problematic. But what is very problematic is that they experience a variety of harms that go from neglect to discrimination, and that affect their academic performance. So to unpack that claim, teachers may not understand the condition and therefore will lack an ethos of reception, to borrow Suarez Orozco's expression, and therefore they will feel alienated, and all the more so because schools in Mexico have a very real record of promoting assimilation, which particularly affected indigenous communities. Then certain expectations will be placed on them because of their appearance, where they will be expected to speak Spanish fluently, to identify as Mexicans, to be monolinguals, and that in many cases that's not the case. They will be the target of discrimination by teachers and peers, which sometimes reenacts discrimination that they experience in the US. They will struggle shifting from English to Spanish as the language of instruction, if they do speak Spanish, and they will be confronted with a foreign pedagogy and with very different cultural codes. They will be required to catch up with curricula that's unknown to them, and all of this will obviously impact their academic performance. There are some data that suggests that students in Mexico with previous experience in the US are more likely to have repeated 1 or 2 school years compared to those whose entire school life transpired in Mexico. Okay, so again, the implication is that when students return to the Mexico educational system, schools should be aware of their needs and their specificities. And this is something that's why I transcribed this quote from the authors I've mentioned many times. Haman Zuniga especially. And I transcribe this quote because it sort of like captures the gist of the argument which we share, that schools need to be sensitive to the binational profiles of these children, and that they need to prepare them, this is an important point, they need to prepare them for adulthoods in both nations. And it's something like dual education, and I will get that in a minute. But I also transcribed this quote because it also shows a disagreement that we may have with the authors, and so it's in italics in the text. That is that we think that actually the burden of responsibility to provide this kind of education falls on American schools and not so much in Mexico schools. Although Mexican schools also have to do things, I'll talk about it in a minute. But the primary responsibility falls on American schools. And this might be controversial, or I'd like to think it's controversial just because that way it's more interesting. But no, I do think it's controversial because somebody might say that it's unfair that you know that Mexico is a sending nation and it is expelling its students, and then American schools should take responsibility for their needs. So let me try to argue why I think that American schools actually have the primary responsibility. I think this is for moral and practical reasons. So I think I've mentioned emphatically throughout the presentation that the U.S. does not provide a guarantee to stay for immigrant families. And because of the immigration policy and as I mentioned, rampant deportations and all this this environment that sort of threatens immigrants and that stigmatizes them. And I think this imposes the obligation on U.S. schools to act preemptively to make sure that children do not suffer as a consequence of that. So I know that many schools already do a lot by not asking children and their parents what their legal status in the nation is, and that's obviously something that's very important. But I think that that's not enough. And so if it's true that schools are supposed to help students to develop capabilities to be able to function in the society, to use the Amartya Sen's notions, and if it's true that these children, it's not entirely clear in which society they will end up as a result of immigration policy, then it seems to follow that schools need to prepare them to be either this society or American society or Mexican society. This is something that we cannot rely on parents to prepare children to transition into the Mexican educational system, because in many cases parents themselves have very little schooling, they come from low socioeconomic backgrounds. But even more so, there's a long-standing tradition in political theory and educational theory that children should receive an education irrespective of the capacities of parents and the decisions of parents. So I think schools have the main responsibility. And I think here there's an analogy with the work of Sarah Drayton Pearson, for those of you who know her work on refugees. She mentions that part of her work has to do with the fact that refugees sometimes you don't know if you need to prepare them to return to the country of origin or to the country of first asylum or to the country where they will be resettled. So that poses challenges to how we educate them. So that's an extreme case, but I think this case is very similar. And then there's another idea a moral argument that I need to develop, and it's just I just want to mention it. Maybe those of you who are philosophers can help me. And that is that it seems to me to matter morally that in one case it is the U.S. that expels immigrant families and their children, so they have an active role in producing the condition they're in, whereas Mexico has a passive role in contributing to their situation, but it does not expel them, but it does not provide them with the economic opportunities for them to stay, for immigrants to stay in Mexico. So there's a distinction there that I think matters when we think about who bears the primary responsibility for for responding to the needs of the students. Then, let me see. Yeah, then there's another moral argument that I think is very relevant in the context of education. An argument that's been developed by Roger Smith, who's a political scientist, and he develops what he calls the principle of coercively constituted identities, which is a very ugly name for a principle. But the principle is very persuasive in the sense that he argues that and he has cases like Arizona in mind, is that when society and public officials discriminate against Mexican Americans, then what, as they have for since the beginning of political times, then they produce a category of people who want to stay in the U.S. to take advantage of the economic opportunities, but who also feel excluded from that country at the cultural level, and then want to retain their culture, their Mexican heritage. And so they have sort of like split identities. With the one, they want to belong to both, and the argument of Smith is that because the state, society have produced that, then they should be able to accommodate their needs, their bicultural. Well, but besides the moral argument, I think there are also very pragmatic reasons why the U.S. should bear responsibility to respond to the needs of these students. And it is that the U.S. has already a long experience developing resources for children of immigrants and training teachers in bilingual education. And it's a capability that would take a lot of effort and time for Mexico to develop. Also that the U.S. has a demographic advantage because it's easier to recruit and train bilingual teachers in the U.S. than in Mexico, and this is for obvious reasons. Right? There are many Mexican Americans in the U.S. And also, returning migrants in Mexico, they tend to be scattered in many schools, and they're not. There might be one returning student in one school, right? And that's it. I think in the U.S. they tend to be clustered around schools, and that sort of makes it easier for American schools to direct their attention. And okay, this I think might be objected on normative grounds. The idea that U.S. schools should provide for these children, because it might sort of challenge the idea of strict equality, of the principle of strict equality of the distribution of resources, because providing this kind of dual education requires resources and requires a lot of effort, and schools in the U.S. are already strained. In many cases they're under-resourced. And so people might object that you're actually going to privilege immigrant citizens, but children at the expense of non-immigrant children. And that might seem objectionable. And I think there might be something to that objection. I guess what I want to say, perhaps too simplistic, in a way, too simplistically, is that educational justice requires an equitable distribution of resources, and not a strict equality in the distribution of those resources. Okay, but that might be a very simple reply. So if you have any comments on this regard, please let me know. And so what do we have in mind when we talk about dual education? Here I have to be I'm going to be very brief, very schematic. But basically, what we have in mind is that U.S. schools have to develop curricular, language, and pedagogical practices that are adequate to the bilingual profiles and bicultural profiles of these children, and that means an enriched curriculum in terms of language, subject matter, cultural approach. As for instance, there need to be courses to promote the development of the mother tongue, as well as basic knowledge about parents' country and origin. There also have to be schools have to develop capacities to access cultural resources selectively. So this is non-cognitive approach where children need to have a capacity to culture switch. They need to acquire metacognitive skills regarding the negotiation of cultures. And they need to have learning how to learn skills. Okay? And when I came here, I had a conversation with Maria Luisa Parra, who's developed Spanish for heritage learners. So if you want to add stuff, please do, because I know this might seem very superficial. But the point is that this approach needs to be additive and not subtractive. Right? So it needs to be culture affirming, the kind of bilingual education that these children get, and not in the again, not to pick on Arizona, nor on the Arizona style where there are these English immersion courses where immigrant children just have 1 year of special education, and they're expected to go into the mainstream. Okay, and so I was going to mention, since I've been spending a few months in New York, I was going to mention an example of a school in New York that sort of practices translanguaging, which I think is it's a practice that's ideal for these children. But I think I'm not going to get into that. Yes, maybe we can talk about this in the Q&A. And so this is just a table that summarizes the view that we have. So the goal, according to the philosophers that we were mentioning in the beginning, the goal is to integrate immigrant children into the society. But actually, we think that, and that way that honors the right to stay that they defend. I think that actually these children have a right to circulate, and then that means that they have to be integrated into the whole society, but they also have to be prepared to transition between home society and host society, which is something that might be forced. Then that means that in the standard view, the view of the right to stay, the idea is that we have to extend the same treatment to children of immigrant families as to non-immigrants. But what we're actually saying is that you don't need to extend the same treatment. You actually have to provide them an education that's suited to their needs and realities. That means that the education you give them is not the same as the one you give to non-immigrants. And then finally, something that I didn't mention a lot here is that, so on the standard view, so the educational duties fall on the whole society, so on the whole state, and they educate children to integrate. But we actually think that the duties fall on both host societies and home society. And this is because schools in Mexico do have to be remove all the bureaucratic obstacles that these children face to enroll into the Mexican system, because up until very recently they needed to have they needed to have their birth certificate stamped in the U.S. if they wanted to start school in Mexico. But that was ridiculous because in many cases, and then they would get the stamp in the U.S. But they couldn't return to the U.S. So there was absurdities like that. And in general, I think there's a lot of obstacles that they have to face. So just Mexican state has to remove all those obstacles, and then maybe have to develop some sensitivities with respect to these children. But so they also have to do stuff. So it's not that they're off the hook. And just to conclude, we think, and here I go back to the normative assumption that I was mentioning in the beginning of the presentation, that it seems to me that theorists like Carens and Miller they're very sensitive about the idea that when you make prescriptive normative claims, you have to be you have to be grounded in reality. You have to be very mindful of constraints, real life constraints, about the feasibility concerns, etc. So for instance, Carens argues that you have to do political theory from the ground up, and that you don't draw your principles from very abstract theories of justice. And Miller as well, he invokes realism in thinking about immigration. But I think that they do not follow their own methodological commitments to the end, Because in a way, as I mentioned in the beginning, someone like Karen says, okay, they have the right to stay, and therefore we have to think that they need to get an education that allows them to stay, that prepares them to stay. But then that makes his theory blind to the needs of children who do not stay. So in a way, he thinks that, well, actually, he defends the idea, the view that we should not have borders. That's more radical idea. So that's the ideal situation. But then he says, okay, the second best is we acknowledge that there will be borders, but then we have to think about the way in which we integrate children. So that being the second best, right? But you also have to think about the third best, right? Which is that some of these children might have to return, and then you have to be ready to say, have principles that that guide action in that respect. And I think that's something like that is having education that serves them to not only to be integrated into society, but to be involved. And I think that's okay.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Juan.
Do you need this?
Oh, do I need
I
that?
think you're loud enough. Well,
I can get pretty.
yeah,
I can
you're
get
the
pretty
teacher
loud.
voice.
Yeah, I can use teacher voice. Sure. But let me know if you'd like me to put on the microphone. All right. Well, yeah. Thank you so much. I think you've made an incredibly compelling argument for why preparing children of immigrant families to thrive across nations is not only a moral imperative but a transnational one. And having shown us the risks of not acknowledging that reality for children, so risks to child development, feelings of alienation and exclusion, neglect, discrimination from teachers, and then that cultural, linguistic, and identity shock, as well as the learning difficulties. And you've also shown us how so many would benefit from education policy that's based on the principle of equity rather than equality in this non-ideal context. And I have to say, I think that your theory holds up against experience. So I come here not just as a doctoral student, but as Mira said, a former teacher. And where I taught, I was working with students who were from immigrant families, often experiencing that circular migration. And the sense of moral obligation that you describe is something that is very familiar to me. And that the risks that you propose are also very, very real for children. So I also agree that this imperative requires the kind of policy changes that you're talking about. And that's where I'd like to begin our discussion, sort of focusing on the realities and exploring what this might mean for your proposed policies, especially because your argument's based in this non-ideal theory. So I think we might benefit from digging deeper into any idealization in the policy as well. That's all right. So first, I agree that educational leaders have an obligation to provide the curriculum, the language pedagogy, and the environment that will allow students to thrive wherever they end up living. And that this definitely looks different for children of immigrant families and is arguably harder. So longer school hours, like you said, more differentiation, dual language programs more widespread. And you acknowledge that this obligation should end up sort of being borne by the US, which I agree with, but I think we might have to take that next step and say that it falls on teachers, individual teachers in the US. Because curriculum planning, language instruction, attitudes towards students are all teacher-centered changes. And so first I just want to thank you for acknowledging the moral space that teachers are working in, that these are, we talked about this earlier, ethical dilemmas that teachers are facing about how to provide this type of education. And you also suggest that the U.S. has more of a capability to provide adequate services and programs to immigrant children, and I think in the paper even suggests that they could facilitate professional development for Mexican teachers as well. And so I agree that it's all relative and that the description you give of teaching preparation in Mexico is quite different from that in the U.S. But I think my experience teaching immigrant children, even within bilingual schools here, doesn't support the assumption that we are capable of providing an adequate education along the guidelines that you describe. And that right now we're currently only operating within Krenz and Miller's limited paradigm of preparation for residency. We haven't even touched on the more complex education that would be necessary to prepare for circular migration. Because teachers and school leaders try, within the US context, to be advocates for immigrant students, trying to secure the pedagogy and the supports that you talk about, but it's common to run into administrative roadblocks in that situation. So teachers often hear, the schedule doesn't permit it, we don't have enough manpower, we just don't have enough students like her to justify that kind of programming, so a lot of utilitarian arguments. And exhausting as it is for teachers to continually advocate for these basics, so constant emailing, hours after school, writing second and third curriculum, it's obviously 10 times more difficult for students who have to live in that reality under circumstances that really aren't preparing them for participation in either the sending or receiving societies. So I think work like yours creates a foundation for making these moral imperatives more visible so that the work does become easier, the preparation and policy becomes more tangible for teachers and school leaders. But I suppose my prompt is, so this moral obligation will fall to teachers to fulfill. And this in itself may be a moral issue. So perhaps acknowledging that reality in your argument would strengthen it. How do you propose that teachers who care deeply about their students deal with the increased demands of the imperatives you put forth within the non-ideal space of school administration? Within the USA context and also within Mexico, where, as you say, and as you show, the need seems even greater. So second, at the risk also, again, of focusing a little more on policy over the theory right now, my second question also relates to the realities of your proposed policy on the international relations side and the proposal of nations working together. Again, if you're working within the realm of non-ideal theory, our current political climate of international relations seems like the ultimate non-ideal context, unfortunately, particularly where USA and Mexican relations are concerned. So with the presence of the America First attitude here in the US, and then across Europe, where I think your theory, I'd love to hear more about how you see your theory applying there, because I think it absolutely does apply. The authoritarian and inward-looking leadership there, how does this affect your argument pragmatically or theoretically about how nations can work together to make this happen? Do you see any responsibility for international organizations, for example, UNICEF, or does this connect to the rights of the child in any way to uphold that moral imperative? So again, I think the next step, I very much agree with the theory, and the next step is to consider how to implement that in the non-ideal context, so that, as you say also about the Krenz and Miller arguments, it can be non-ideal from the ground up. So hope you can begin by talking a bit about that. Thank you so much.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, if you want to respond to Tatiana briefly, then we can open it up. Yeah. And when you turn up your mic, that's really great.
Yeah, those are great questions. I have no response to. But just, well, like I was saying, I don't mean to put Maria Luisa Parra on this spot here, but I keep talking about her. But she's developed a great program for Spanish for heritage learners, and I think that, of course, that's at the college level, but I think that, that's the kind of thing that schools should be thinking about. Of course, as you mentioned, it falls on teachers to do that. Teachers are already overwhelmed by what they have to deal with. Sometimes they have difficulties just helping children to integrate into society. But so I think, I don't know, maybe this would be a good policy area where now that philanthropy is so so important, it has come to substitute the state in many ways. Maybe it's a sort of space where philanthropists could sort of like start to put their money in. But this is this is a question I really don't know. It's true. It's very interesting. I hadn't thought about that. That actually, if you propose this, you might actually put a burden on teachers that they cannot that they cannot carry, and that might be moral in the sense that you're asking too much from them, and that's not appropriate. So that's a great point. I need to think about it. I have no response to that. And on the IR side, yeah, I think that's I guess a utopia, right? That thinking that a global institution could implement, try to enforce policies that have children to have a transnational curriculum. But I guess there are, Europe would be the place to look at that, because they really have, at least in higher education, and also not only higher education actually, also in K-12, they really have found ways to cooperate, especially higher education. But there's a lot of mobility among students, and something that other parts of the world do not have. It also happens that Europe is very small, and that they can, and it's an affluent continent. But again, this is something I don't have. I don't see any international global institution having any to promote this kind of concern. But yeah, also I have to think about this. Thank you very much.
The floor is open.
Great. So I have two questions. The one is, I think there's an underemphasis on the ethical responsibility of the sending country, who are technically not sending, in this case Mexico. And I think ethical because if we have the moral argument and you take it to its logical conclusion, is it not unethical to create a society in which the people that reside there feel they can't live there, even if they have to face quite adverse circumstances wherever they're going? And for me, it's the same strain that you're using to argue that the US, because they send out immigrants and do not want to receive them, they have therefore that moral obligation. But I think it's the same. It's on the same continuum, so I have a question around that. I think you do discuss it, but briefly, and it seems more bureaucratic than sort of the same sort of practical, detailed implications that you've mentioned about the US in terms of Mexico, either not creating those conditions, which is an economic argument maybe, but also in supporting the return migrants. How would they practically do that? And then I think a second question is, what about, how does this apply to other foreigners in America? Is this a Mexico-US arrangement? And if so, is that moral? I know there's the high migration numbers from, say, India and Asia in America, and similar situations, they're immigrants, so they may be here for a short time, a long time. How do you treat that? And do you then have a utilitarian argument to justify that? Is it the numbers? If you reach 25%, then you have a program or you don't. And then I think practically leading to the teacher question, what happens in a school where you have multiple, now it's Mexican and Indian and Asian and African. I mean, Africa has how many countries? So yeah, just trying to figure out my mind about it.
So,
Yeah,
so you're absolutely right that I might have underemphasized the ethical responsibility of some of there. Of course, they do have. I guess that's why I also wanted to put the pragmatic reasons as well. So like they work together. So you might say that Mexico has the responsibility as well to. So for instance, say that has a responsibility to teach English to all the students. So that way they have to leave, then they will be able to sort of manage, and then. But I just think that I guess the case I'm focusing on is more like when very young children who sort of like left Mexico from a very young age, and they actually the school system in Mexico hasn't even had the chance to put their hands on, so to speak that. So that's one reason why I think I focus more on why I think the U.S. has primary responsibility. But no, you're absolutely right. This is something that where I was mentioning that I think there's a lot of more philosophical work to do. If it matters that one society is actually kicking them out, while the other one is not kicking them out, but it's not giving them the opportunity they deserve. So I think there is work to be done there. I think it's you can argue on the Mexican side that since the state is in many cases a failed state, this is not true for all of Mexico, but it's certainly true for some of the areas of Mexico where these immigrants are coming from. They're coming from really failed states. So the question there is if you can argue that, well, yeah, they have the Mexican state has a responsibility, but since they cannot fulfill it, then the U.S. has to take up the slack. So I think that's more or less the kind of argument that I want to make. But you're absolutely right. It's something I actually, so I want to continue working on the ethical side of this, and I think that's one of the things that has to be kind of fully developed. And then the other thing is that I know that I would like to say that we have to start thinking about other migratory circuits in this way, and I think that actually the case of, for instance, some African nations and their relationship with the former, the colonial, in the context of decolonization. I think this is very relevant, and I think that but of course you cannot just extrapolate it because there are historical differences that are very relevant. So that's another thing I want to pursue. Again, that's my response. And then the part about what's your question? If it's a utilitarian calculation that I'm making, I think in a way, I think it's not because I am the moral idea behind this account is that you have to give children the education they will need to thrive, right? And that's a moral imperative that's not consequential. It's just a sort of like a deontological claim if you want to. You have to challenge children because they deserve that and they need to have tools to flourish. But then you also, again, when it comes to grounding this, and you have to take into account the context, etc. I mean, we do have to make some utilitarian considerations. So if there are students from a country, they're the only students in a country in the school, and then they're on teachers to teach them whatever language they can teach, that they speak. Well, I mean, just cannot be done. Right? So, I mean, there has to be some consequentialist argument, I think, like constraining this. I don't know if that makes sense. Yeah, but thank you for that.
So I'm thinking a lot about the realities of power dynamics. So I totally agree. I like the vision of what you're talking about. I'm thinking a lot about your comments about how the burden ends up falling on the teachers. And thinking about how do you start to move power structures to get people to open up opportunities. And so it seems to me that it is worth thinking about how do we educate administrators for the complexities of these problems before things end up at the teacher level, number one. So I think there's a lot of work to be done with the U.S. administrators. And then as you start to, but broader, as we start to think about issues of justice, and you're thinking about education around migration, I think your points about building broad capacities for kids to live biculturally is really important as we think about immigrant origin kids. But one of the things I think there's a failure in the dominant society is even to think ethically about issues of migration, because there's a total failure to understand migration. It's not taught about in school very much. And when it's taught about to immigrant kids. So when it talks about like an ethical choice about allocating more dollars and more time, to schools with immigrant origin kids, we are so ill prepared as a society to think about that because we've never been taught about these issues. We've never really reflected on them. And for the most part, schools are rather assimilationist in their practices, not integrationists, right? They're at the very beginning basics of it, which isn't to say there aren't great models, because there are. So I'm just thinking a lot about where else do we need specialization to start to move the whole conversation forward and involve the dominant society and the power structures of schools.
Yeah, well, that's a great question. I mean, I really think that, for instance, to go back to the AI representation I mentioned, did I mention it? I didn't mention it.
Yeah.
Well, there was the AI representation a week ago, and there was actually a panel on these issues, and I'm completely, I don't remember her name, but there was a school administrator from California who was talking about these issues. She was the commentator, and well, she was talking about all these predicaments teachers face and about what's to be done, etc. And she was obviously of, this might not be very hard to get, she was of Hispanic origin. And I think that, I mean, there has to be a shift that just simply related to demographics. And I think that will help, and that's certainly something that's very foreseeable future. Like I don't know. I don't know if there's anything else to be honest to count on, but I think that definitely has to make an impact. I mean, I completely agree that this is. So I'm complaining about currents and Miller because they're not grounded enough, but I also agree that even the accountant reading is to some extent has not elements of idealization. So yeah, I guess all I can say is I agree with it. There's a whole power dynamic.
And I agree with you.
Well, thank you. I'm Maria Luisa Parra, since Juan graciously mentioned my work. I'm faculty of Romance Languages and Literatures, and have been developing these courses for heritage speakers, Latino students. And I think that this topic is fascinating because I think this migration is not new. I mean, the flow between Mexico and the US has been there since the beginning of the times. And the way both countries are intertwined is so deep, and it goes back so far in history, that I think that education should be part of, for all students, not just immigrant students and teachers, but it should be part of the general curriculum. I'm so surprised that Latino students don't know any history of Mexico or Latin America and this relationship with the US. My class is on Spanish, but I teach history and some linguistic concepts that really help them to make sense of their worlds as bilingual, bicultural, and transnational students. But I think that it would be wonderful if these models can be taken to the whole, body of students, Anglo students from other countries. I see really a need of changing frameworks in education broadly, so everybody knows that, my classmate is coming from different heritage background, and where is my heritage, and what happens with others, and what is the flow affecting our classrooms. Parents, of course, teachers need to be educated, and parents too. I worked many years with Latino children, parents, and teachers, and we observe how children who had most success in adaptation processes, academic success, and bilingualism were those children where parents and teachers not only communicated at the linguistic level, but shared expectations and strategies to move students forward. So, it's amazing that, when you're presenting the impact of that policy it should be, brought in the society in Mexico and in the U.S. as well. So thank you for bringing these important issues.
No, and I agree. And I mean, of course, here there's always the issue of against that view, which I completely share. There's always the concern or the claim that threatens the cultural integrity of,
Well,
which is a claim that can be made in a very simplistic way. But there are also people who defend it seriously, and that that you might. What do you do if really the society, thinking in specific context and specific school district, if parents don't want that kind of education?
right. Well,
And so.
I think it's a fascinating time in terms of attention because all the borders are becoming more not a line but a borderland, right? A space, and those spaces are growing, and we all feel funny about not being able to draw a concrete line that distinguishes from others, but those lines are being erased in, with all this back and forth. So new paradigms, new ways of thinking about nationality. Even in my field, linguistics, the notion of language nation is being challenged in very important ways.
Okay, thank you for this. I think the idealization is great. I think I'm struggling with the reality of it and trying to wrap my head around some of the political economy of how this would work potentially. And I ask, because as I'm thinking of an extension of this and thinking about refugee-based contexts or contexts impacted by conflict specifically. So for a long time, refugees in their countries of first asylum have had absolutely separate systems of schooling, similar sort of ideas of what you're talking about in terms of language, history, cultural traditions, and oftentimes there was a real sort of ethical tension there where refugees have continued to underperform within systems of education because they don't have sort of the language of the dominant language and the other skills that are needed to succeed. And so UNHCR has actually tried to push globally for this idea of integration or inclusion, not even integration because that is too political a word right now, but the inclusion of refugees within national systems of education, which basically means that refugees will follow the same curriculum as host country nationals. And so now as you think about this, right, this is actually sort of pushing away from that or is trying to expand the boundary a little bit and say, well, let's not just think about inclusion, but also think about the idea of return. But that doesn't quite reflect the contemporary context of conflict, where return is oftentimes not possible for several different reasons. And so I'm wondering if you have tried to float this idea in sort of just the policy circles and what is the kind of responses that has generated at all, even given the fact that, as you acknowledge that this is not necessarily grounded, but it's an idealization in some ways.
But actually, I think that's a very great question because I think it precisely reflects upon so thinking about how this case, the case of immigration in the U.S. and Mexico, how it is similar but also different to the case of refugees, so that we should rely on both. Because in the case of refugees, as you mentioned, it's really not clear that they will be returned to
Right.
But actually, in most cases, they don't return. It's a case by case basis, but in many cases they don't return. And so you kind of have to work with that assumption on the back of your mind. But this case is completely different. The case here is that they might return, but if they don't return, they will stay. So you just have to, two clear choices that they might be confronted with. And I think that makes it more, so in that sense, that's the reason why it actually should be very different from the case of refugees. No, I don't think that makes sense. So here you should be thinking about integration or inclusion, whatever you want to call it, but also just that, it is a different set of choices that you have to be exposed to. I don't know if that makes sense. No.
I hear you, but I don't necessarily agree.
But why?
And I think the reason I'd say that is because a lot of it is based on probability and on chance, as you were speaking about it, right? And I don't see the choices as clear as return or stay. I think there's a lot, like migration itself is such a complex process, and there are many different moving pieces in it. So even if you think of countries of first asylum, so let's think of Niger, or let's think of Lebanon, for instance. Syrians in Lebanon don't know exactly where they're going. Are they going to Germany? Are they going to Greece? Are they going to be stuck in Turkey? Nobody knows. But if you were to speak with the Lebanese Minister of Education, he'd be quite happy to say, let me offer a separate system of education that ensures that Syrians can actually return to Syria, because I don't want Syrians within Lebanon. But that is very much a tension with what the Syrians themselves want, right? And so I think there's just a lot of complexity in that process, and so I don't see it as neat and clear cut.
But I think in this case, so I agree that that's a very complicated scenario. But I guess my point is that in this case, it's not complicated. They will either be here or there. I mean, we cannot prepare them for. So this is something that when you think about preparing children, these children for like transnational possibilities. Well, that's expression in this context. It's like it doesn't make any sense. It's just two possibilities: the U.S. or Mexico. So in the case of refugees, yeah, you can be preparing. When you're teaching a Syrian refugee, yeah, I mean, who knows where you end up? But you see that's not.
I see that, but I guess then part of it is just like what are the boundaries of this idea in some ways, right? Of like, is it so bounded and unique and specific to this case that it cannot be extrapolated onward? And if it can't, then how do we think about its broader utility in other contexts of migration? Let aside forced migration, or because I mean the moment you bring in the argument of failed states, like that is the idea of forced migration right there, right? So I'm just trying to think about.
Well, I think that many claims. So perhaps this is something. This might be the source of disagreement. That I don't have much confidence, or I don't think that it's very useful even to try to think about models that can be sort of like universalized, completely. So I think that so you can make moral claims and you can make sort of moral prescriptions for very bounded contexts. And then when you think about a different context, you sort of like you have to tweak with that sort of like model or account. But you do, so for instance, we can very well say, okay, this idea that I have presented here does not work for the case of refugees in Syria right now. And that's why I mentioned that in the presentation that the refugee is more extreme, much more extreme. But you could sort of like, I guess you have to think that on a case-by-case basis. And even then it has, you can make small prescriptions about it. You can try to sort of like formalize it.
So can I pick up on Peter's point, though, I think in a way that's not about the generalizing to refugees. So I was thinking circular migration is happening partly because of active deportations, right? But it's also happening because of essentially passive expulsion via discrimination and prejudice, right? So, the self-deportation idea, right? And so there may be people who have the legal right to stay in the United States, but for various reasons, staying here is unpleasant, right? And now less pleasant than going back to Mexico. And so there I was thinking about, say, Turkish families in Germany, or some North African families in France, or some Indonesian or other Muslim families in Holland or in Denmark, and where you have circular migration, not because of active deportation, but because of the experience of prejudice and discrimination, right, in the receiving country. And so then you have this weird, so I think this is how it connects to Vider's point about the sort of the inclusive education versus not. If that is the reason that you have circular migration, and you are saying under conditions of circular migration, the host country is responsible for providing a bicultural education, right? Then essentially then the conclusion is that where the host country indulges discrimination and prejudice against a migrant group such that you end up with circular migration, the host country is also responsible for providing an education that is different from the education that its non-migrant citizens receive. And since you pointed out that this applies even to U.S. citizens, right, to children of, right, so we're talking about the U.S. citizen children of Mexican migrant parents, then you start to get closer and closer to, say, Turks in Germany, right? You know, this idea of a separate education system, even for nationals, right? Even for citizens, because the conditions of life in the host country are such that they may prompt circular migration. And that seems like an ethical problem.
Okay, that's good. Is that, well, so I guess I really, so I sort of like sense that objection, and so that's why I really don't think that it has to be separate education. I think it has to be supplementary. So for instance, I don't think that they have to be receiving math class. They should be different, like an immigrant child and a non-immigrant child. Math in a different classroom, that doesn't make any sense. Or they shouldn't take English, that doesn't make any sense. But I do think that there are ways in which you can tweak with the curriculum and say, okay, there are things that maybe you need to get and other children don't. I mean, that's why it's sort of like supplementary school. Or maybe in some instance, slight variations. But it's not like a separate, educational track. So that I completely agree with that. That's not the case. I don't know. Or that still doesn't.
We'll follow up with that in our dinner. I know that there are people behind.
I just have one question from ignorance, because I don't know much about this terminology. But when you talk about circular migration, can you talk about just one host country? Because I'm thinking that Mexico is going to be a host country, and as a host country, Mexico, I grew up in Mexico, and I didn't know anything about the Chicano, Latino reality in this country until I came here. And then I started experiencing all these things that, was I Mexican, Latina, where was I? So, and I was born in the US, and I went back to Mexico when I was 2 years. And then I came here when I was 29. So I started rethinking my own story when I came here in 97, but Mexico is a host country now. And Mexicans don't know anything about this reality here that Chicanos and Latino children go through, or youth people. So I'm just wondering if we should add, another host country and think about the circular migration between two poles and what can we do now?
Yeah, no, you're right. That even kind of conceptually, right? If you're thinking of a circular process, then
maybe there's a technicality that doesn't allow that to happen, but I was just wondering.
No, you're right. That yeah, you're right. I guess in a way, I guess that seems like it's going to be an increasing problem. So I guess if we have to prioritize and say, okay, we need to do things in order, then I think number one is, I guess that's my very ad hoc response. So we first worry about this, and then we also worry about Mexican state doing that. So I think you're right. I mean, that's also happening. But I think in a way that's sort of like a less of it's less complex than it's sort of like to teach Chicano culture to Mexican students than it is to teach children who were brought up here to teach them Mexican history. But that might be a very arbitrary response. I admit that. But so I have to think about that. But you're absolutely right. That also needs to be part of that. That I might be sort of downplaying the amount of things that Mexican schools have to do.
So I think, given that it's 6 o'clock, I'm going to call us to an official close. I'm assuming that you're happy to turn around and answer